I'm 78 years old, and everyone in this town knows me as Apple Pie Margaret. For decades, I've been selling my pies and cookies at the local farmers market. Folks around here smile when they see me, ask about my recipes, and tell me my baking reminds them of their childhoods. But no one knows the dark secret I've kept buried for 60 years. I was born in 1945 in rural Virginia, the youngest of 6 children. My father, Robert Wilson, owned the town's small grocery store. To everyone outside our home, he was a respected businessman, always seen with his hat and pipe, nodding politely to passersby. But behind closed doors, he was a different man entirely, controlling, cruel, and unpredictable. While my brothers went to school and played freely, my sister Elizabeth and I were expected to end our education early and learn housekeeping. Girls don't need book learning, Father would say, bringing his fist down on the dinner table. Mother would flinch, but say nothing. Her silence was a lesson in survival I didn't understand until much later. By 17, I was desperate to escape. I'd watch the trucks roll through town and imagine myself in them, traveling to faraway places I'd only read about in books hidden under my mattress. That's when Michael Carter arrived in Pinewood. He was 25, handsome in a way that made my heart race, with stories of cities I'd never seen and promises of a life beyond our small town. "I'll take you to see the ocean someday," he told me, once as we sat on the back steps of the grocery store during my break. I'd never seen the ocean, never even left Virginia. To me, Michael represented freedom, possibility, escape. When he asked me to marry him after just 3 months of courtship, I said yes without hesitation. Father didn't approve. Michael wasn't from around here, didn't come from money, drove a truck for a living. But even Father knew he couldn't keep his unmarried daughter at home forever without folks talking. The week before our wedding, Mother and my sisters threw a small celebration. Nothing fancy, just family gathering for a special dinner. Michael had gone with his cousin to get fitted for a suit in the neighboring town and wouldn't be back until morning. It was late when I went up to my bedroom, my head full of wedding plans and dreams of my new life. I didn't hear the door open. I was brushing my hair when I caught his reflection in the mirror. Father, standing in the doorway watching me. Something in his eyes made my blood run cold. "You think you're better than us now," he said, his words slightly slurred from the whiskey he'd been drinking all evening. I tried to speak, to tell him that wasn't true, but the words caught in my throat as he moved closer. What happened next has haunted my nightmares for 60 years. My own father, the man who was supposed to protect me, violated me in the most fundamental way on the night before I was to begin my new life. In the morning, I said nothing. What could I say? Who would believe me? In our town in 1963, a man's word was law, especially a man like my father. I walked down the aisle the next day with a smile fixed on my face and horror in my heart. Michael noticed nothing unusual, just wedding day nerves, he thought. 2 months later, I realized I was pregnant. And I knew, God help me, I knew that the baby wasn't Michael's. But what could I possibly do? There were no DNA tests back then, no way to prove what I knew in my heart. So I kept another secret and prayed that somehow everything would turn out all right. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would span generations and test the very limits of my strength and sanity. In 1964, I gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. We named her Sarah. I was terrified when they first placed her in my arms, afraid I'd see my father's face looking back at me. But all I saw was an innocent child, my daughter, regardless of how she came to be. Michael was overjoyed. He doted on Sarah, called her his little princess, spent hours just watching her sleep. His love for her was pure and complete, and seeing them together broke my heart anew each day, knowing the truth I kept hidden. For 6 months, we lived in a fragile bubble of new parenthood. Michael had found steady work at a shipping company, and we rented a small house on the edge of town. I'd convinced him to move us away from the center, away from my family's constant presence. My father hadn't visited since Sarah's birth, and I thanked God for small mercies. But then one Sunday afternoon, while Michael was working an extra shift, there was a knock at our door. I opened it, Sarah on my hip, and felt the ground tilt beneath me. There stood my father, the same pipe in his mouth, the same hat in his hands. "Thought I'd come see my granddaughter," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I clutched Sarah tighter, backing away. "She's sleeping," I lied, though she was wide awake, staring at this stranger with curious eyes. "Doesn't look like she's sleeping to me," he remarked, reaching for her. I turned away, protecting her with my body. "Don't touch her." His face darkened. "She's my granddaughter." "She's my daughter," I said, finding a courage I didn't know I had, "and I want you to leave." He studied my face, then Sarah's, and something shifted in his expression. A terrible understanding dawned in his eyes. He knew that I knew, and worse, he realized what I was implying, that Sarah wasn't just his granddaughter. "People would think you're crazy if you ever told such lies," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "A respected man like me? Who would believe you?" "Michael would," I said, though I wasn't certain. Would he? Or would he hate me for keeping such a secret? Father left that day, but the threat lingered. A week later, I convinced Michael we needed to move far away. I told him I wanted a fresh start, somewhere with more opportunities for our family. He was hesitant to leave his new job, but I was insistent to the point of tears. Looking back, I think he sensed something was wrong, but couldn't name it. We packed what little we owned and moved to North Carolina, not telling anyone our destination, not even my mother or siblings. For 2 years, we lived in peace. Sarah grew into a chattering toddler with Michael's smile, though she had my father's eyes, something Michael never noticed or mentioned. I began baking pies to sell to neighbors, using my grandmother's recipes as therapy, a way to connect to happier memories of my childhood. Then, one ordinary Tuesday, I looked up from hanging laundry to see a familiar car pulling into our driveway. My father had found us. And this time, he wasn't leaving without getting what he wanted. "How did you find us?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper as he stood on our porch. "You think I don't have friends who know people? This country's smaller than you think, Margaret." He looked past me into the house. "Where's my granddaughter?" I blocked the doorway. "She's not here." His eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me, girl. I've come a long way." Then his voice softened, became almost gentle. "I just want to see her. Is that so wrong? A grandfather wanting to see his granddaughter?" The terrible truth of those words made my stomach turn. "You need to leave." "I will after I see Sarah." He paused, then added, "Unless you'd rather I have a talk with Michael first, man to man." The threat hung in the air between us. If he told Michael, but what exactly would he tell him? The truth? A twisted version of it? Either way, it would destroy everything. 10 minutes, I said finally, and then you go and you don't come back. I let him in, watching like a hawk as he sat in our living room with Sarah, who was shy around this stranger. He brought her a doll, which she accepted cautiously. The whole scene felt surreal, this monster playing the doting grandfather while I stood by, unable to scream the truth. He kept his promise that day and left after his visit. But a week later, he returned. And then again the following month, each time with a gift for Sarah, each time with the same implicit threat hanging over our interactions. Michael was puzzled by these visits from my father, especially since we'd moved partly to get away from my family. He said, "I thought you didn't get along with your folks." I replied, unable to meet his eyes. "He seems fond of Sarah," Michael observed. "That's something, at least." If only he knew the terrible reason behind that fondness. The breaking point came when Sarah was nearly 3. My father arrived unannounced while Michael was home. They talked for hours while I hovered anxiously nearby. When my father left, Michael's face was ashen. "What did he tell you?" I asked, my heart pounding. He looked at me as if seeing a stranger. He said Sarah might not be mine, that you were involved with someone else before our wedding. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was a poisonous half-truth. "Michael, I can explain." "Is it true?" His voice was hollow. "Is there a chance she's not mine?" I couldn't lie to him anymore. "Yes," I whispered. "But it's not what you think." He held up his hand. "I need some air." Michael walked out that night. I was certain he wouldn't return, that our marriage was over. I sat on the kitchen floor and wept until there were no tears left, wondering how I would raise Sarah alone, how I would protect her from the truth. But at dawn, the door opened, and Michael came back. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face haggard. He knelt beside me on the kitchen floor. "I don't care," he said hoarsely. "I don't care if she's not my blood. She's my daughter in every way that matters. I've loved her since the moment I saw her." My tears started again. "Michael, but we can't stay here. Your father, there's something not right about the way he looks at her, at both of you. We need to go where he can't find us." And so, for the second time, we packed our lives and fled in the night. What we couldn't know then was that we were carrying the seeds of tragedy with us, that some secrets are too dark to outrun. We settled in the mountains of eastern Tennessee in a small town where no one knew us. Michael found work at a lumber mill, and I started baking again, first for neighbors, then for a local diner. My apple pies became something of a local legend, earning me the nickname that would stick for decades. "Apple Pie Margaret," the mill workers would call as I delivered fresh pies to the diner. "Best thing that ever happened to this town." For a while, we were happy. Michael doted on Sarah as if the conversation about her parentage had never happened. We added to our family when I gave birth to our son, David, a child who was undeniably Michael's, with his same crooked smile and gentle nature. Years passed in relative peace. Sarah grew into a bright, confident girl who excelled in school. David followed her sister around like a devoted puppy. Michael was promoted at the mill, and I built a small business selling my baked goods, eventually opening a stall at the local farmer's market. One day, a letter arrived from my mother. My father had suffered a massive heart attack and died. The news should have brought relief, but instead, I felt a strange emptiness. The monster of my nightmares was gone, yet the damage he'd done lived on. "Are you okay?" Michael asked that night, finding me staring out the kitchen window. "Yes," I said. "I'm free now." He wrapped his arms around me, and for the first time, I truly believed we might outrun the past. Sarah turned 16, then 17, becoming a young woman so quickly it took my breath away. She was beautiful, smart, with dreams of becoming a doctor. When she received a scholarship to a good college a few hours away, Michael and I were bursting with pride. But life has a cruel way of circling back on itself. During her first year of college, Sarah met a young medical student named James Marshall. When she brought him home during spring break, I saw the same look in her eyes that I'd once had for Michael: hope, adoration, the thrill of first love. James was charming, ambitious, and clearly smitten with Sarah. They dated through her sophomore year, and by her junior year, they were engaged to be married after graduation. "Isn't it too soon?" I asked her privately, worried about history repeating itself. "Mom, when you know," she said, her face glowing with happiness. "Didn't you feel that way about Dad?" The irony of her question wasn't lost on me. "Yes," I said, "I did." The wedding plans proceeded. Sarah graduated with honors and was accepted to the same medical school where James was now in his residency. Everything seemed perfect, their future bright with promise. But 3 months before the wedding, Sarah came home unexpectedly one weekend. I found her sitting on the porch swing, her eyes red from crying. "Honey, what's wrong?" I asked, my heart sinking. "Mom," she whispered, "I'm pregnant." I should have been overjoyed at the prospect of becoming a grandmother. Instead, a terrible foreboding washed over me. "Does James know?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It's not his, Mom. It can't be." The world tilted beneath me. "What do you mean?" "We've been careful, waiting until after the wedding. But then there was this professor who's been mentoring me. He said he could help me with my medical school application, make sure I got accepted." My blood ran cold. "Sarah, what happened?" "He invited me to his home to discuss my application. His wife was supposed to be there, but she wasn't. He gave me a drink. I don't remember much after that." I took her hands in mine, dreading the answer to my next question. "This professor? What's his name?" "Dr. Robert Wilson. He's from Virginia originally. He said he might even be a distant relative given our last name." In that moment, I knew with horrifying clarity that my nightmare wasn't over. It had merely skipped a generation. The room spun around me as Sarah's words sank in. Dr. Robert Wilson. From Virginia. A distant relative. "Mom?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from far away. "Mom, are you okay? You've gone white as a sheet." I forced myself to focus on her face, my beautiful daughter who had no idea of the horror unfolding. "This professor," I managed to ask, "how old is he?" "In his 50s, I think." "Why? Mom, what's wrong?" My father would have been in his 70s by then, so it couldn't be him. But the name, the connection to Virginia, a terrible suspicion formed in my mind. "Sarah, I need you to tell me everything you can remember about him. What he looks like, anything he's told you about himself." As she described him, tall, always well-dressed, with a particular way of tilting his head when listening, a chill ran through me. These were my father's mannerisms. And when she mentioned he always carried a distinctive pipe that had belonged to his father, I knew. This wasn't some distant relative. This was my father's son, perhaps from an affair or a relationship before he married my mother. A half-brother I never knew existed, which meant, "Sarah, listen to me," I said, gripping her hands tightly. "This man, he's dangerous. We need to report him to the police, to the university, immediately." She pulled back confused. "What? Why? I mean, yes, what he did was wrong, but I was drinking too, and I barely remember." "No," I cut her off. "This isn't your fault. None of it. But there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you years ago." And so, sitting on that porch swing with the afternoon sun filtering through the trees, I finally told my daughter the truth about her birth, about my father's assault, about how Michael had accepted her as his own despite knowing she might not be her biological daughter. Sarah listened in stunned silence, her hands protectively covering her belly as the horrific implications dawned on her. "This professor," she whispered finally, "he's my half-brother," I confirmed, "which means the baby." She bent forward, retching with the realization. I held her hair back, murmuring soothing words that felt hollow given the circumstances. When she could speak again, her voice was steel. "We have to stop him. He can't do this to anyone else." James arrived the next day, having driven through the night when Sarah called him. I watched anxiously as they talked privately in the garden, saw him pull her into his arms, saw her shoulders shake with sobs. When they came back inside, James's face was grim but determined. "We're going to the police. All of us. This stops now." The following weeks were a blur of police reports, DNA tests, and painful revelations. The investigation uncovered that Dr. Robert Wilson had a history of inappropriate relationships with female students at 3 different universities. He'd simply changed his name and moved on when suspicions arose. DNA confirmed what we already knew. He was indeed my half-brother, Sarah's uncle. The case against him was building, but the most damning evidence came when 2 other students came forward with similar stories. Through it all, James remained steadfastly by Sarah's side. "I love you," he told her, "and I'll love this child too. This changes nothing about our future together." Sarah made the brave decision to continue with the pregnancy, despite the circumstances. This baby is innocent, just like I was. In the midst of this nightmare, there was one small mercy. Michael didn't have to face this new horror. He had passed away from a sudden heart attack 2 years earlier, never knowing how our family's tragedy would come full circle. As the case against Robert Wilson Jr. proceeded to trial, I couldn't help but wonder, how many other victims were out there? How many lives my father's evil had touched beyond our own? The darkness had found us again, despite all our running. But this time, we weren't facing it alone, and we weren't hiding in shame. This time, we were fighting back.
The trial was scheduled for early spring. Sarah, now visibly pregnant, would have to testify, reliving her trauma before a courtroom of strangers. The thought kept me awake at night. "I can do this, Mom," she assured me one evening as we sat on the porch. "For all the women who can't speak up. For you." Her courage humbled me. At 25, she possessed a strength I hadn't found until much later in life. James had postponed his residency to support Sarah through the trial and pregnancy. They had moved into our house temporarily, turning David's old bedroom into a nursery. My son, now 22 and attending college a few hours away, called often to check on his sister. "Are you going to testify too, Mom?" he asked during one of these calls. "Yes," I replied. "It's time to bring everything into the light." The prosecution had asked me to testify about my own experience with my father. It would help establish a pattern of behavior, they said, even though my father was long dead and couldn't be charged. The legal term was propensity evidence, showing that this kind of predatory behavior ran in the family. 2 weeks before the trial was set to begin, I received a phone call from a woman named Helen. "You don't know me," she began, "but I think we have something in common." She had seen the news reports about the case against Robert Wilson Jr. The name had caught her attention because she had been married to a Robert Wilson, my father, for a brief period in the 1940s before he met my mother. We had a son together. I left when Robert became violent, but he took the boy from me when he was 5. Said I was an unfit mother, and the courts believed him. I never saw my son again. My hands trembled as I held the phone. That son would be Robert Wilson Jr., I said. Yes, she confirmed. I've spent decades searching for him, wondering what kind of man he became. Her voice broke. Now I know, and I wish I didn't. Helen agreed to testify at the trial. Her story would help establish how the cycle of abuse had continued across generations. The day the trial began, Sarah, James, and I arrived at the courthouse to find a small group of women waiting outside. Some held signs reading, "We believe you," and "Break the silence." They formed a protective corridor for us to walk through, offering words of encouragement. Inside, I saw him for the first time, Robert Wilson Jr., my half-brother, the man who had assaulted my daughter. The family resemblance was unmistakable. He had our father's eyes, the same eyes that Sarah had inherited, the same eyes that Sarah's unborn child might have too. He didn't look at us as we took our seats. Throughout the prosecutor's opening statement, he stared straight ahead, his face impassive. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand with my head held high. The courtroom fell silent as I swore to tell the truth I had kept hidden for so many decades. "Mrs. Carter," the prosecutor began, "please tell the court about your relationship with Robert Wilson Sr."
I took a deep breath and looked directly at the jury. "Robert Wilson Sr. was my father," I said clearly, "and when I was 17 years old, the night before my wedding, he came into my bedroom and assaulted me." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge called for order. In the gallery, I could see Sarah gripping James's hand, tears streaming down her face. For the next hour, I laid bare the darkest chapter of my life. I spoke of the pregnancy that resulted, of my husband Michael's love and acceptance, of our flight from my father's continuing threats. I spoke of the day we learned of his death, the false sense of security we'd felt, and the devastating realization that his evil had continued through his son. Throughout my testimony, Robert Jr. never looked at me, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his hands. When I finished, the defense attorney approached for cross-examination. His strategy was clear from the first question. "Mrs. Carter, why didn't you report this alleged incident at the time it occurred?" It was a question I had anticipated, but it still stung. It was 1963. I was 17, about to be married. My father was a respected businessman in our community. Who would have believed me? The attorney pressed on, trying to undermine my credibility, suggesting that I had invented this story to help my daughter's case. But with each question, I grew more resolute rather than less. "Sir," I said finally, "I have carried this secret for 60 years. I've spent my life running from it, hiding it, pretending it didn't happen. Why would I choose now, at 78 years old, to subject myself to this public scrutiny if it weren't the truth?" As I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt a weight lifting, not completely gone, but lighter than it had been in decades. The next day, Helen took the stand. She was in her 90s now, frail but determined. She testified about her brief, difficult marriage to my father, about how he had taken her son and cut her out of his life completely. "The last time I saw my boy was 5 years old. Robert told him I was dead. I've lived all these years knowing my son was out there, being raised by a monster, likely becoming one himself." When Sarah's turn came, she walked to the stand with her head high, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. The courtroom fell silent as she began to speak. But no one could have predicted the shocking revelation that was about to change everything we thought we knew. As Sarah began her testimony, the calm, professional demeanor she had maintained cracked slightly. Her voice trembled as she recounted how Robert Wilson Jr. had groomed her as a student, positioning himself as a mentor and father figure. "He knew who I was," she said. "He sought me out specifically when I applied to the pre-med program. He had my full background, my family history. He told me we might be distant relatives, given our shared last name." The prosecutor guided her through the events leading up to the assault, careful not to re-traumatize her with unnecessary details. When she described waking up in his home, confused and in pain, several jurors visibly recoiled. Throughout her testimony, Robert Jr. stared straight ahead, his expression unchanged. But when Sarah mentioned the baby, his niece's child, his own flesh and blood, something shifted in his face. "The DNA test confirmed it," Sarah said. "The baby I'm carrying is the result of that assault. A child who will be both my daughter and my cousin." It was then that Robert Jr. finally looked at her, a fleeting expression of shock crossing his features, before he composed himself again. I wondered if he had somehow convinced himself she was lying about the pregnancy, or perhaps he hadn't made the connection about what it meant. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal. He suggested Sarah had pursued her professor, that the relationship was consensual, that she had invented the assault story when she discovered she was pregnant and feared James would leave her. Sarah remained composed, though I could see the toll it was taking. "Why would I choose this?" she asked him directly. "Why would I put myself and my family through this nightmare if it weren't true?" When the day's proceedings ended, we were exhausted. The media had been following the case closely, and we had to push through a crowd of reporters outside the courthouse. One shouted a particularly vicious question at Sarah about the baby, and I saw James physically restraining himself from confronting the man. That night, as we sat in the living room trying to decompress, the phone rang. It was the prosecutor. "Robert Wilson Jr. wants to make a deal," she said. "What kind of deal?" I asked, putting the call on speaker so Sarah and James could hear. "He'll plead guilty to reduced charges if Sarah agrees not to pursue a paternity claim for the child. He doesn't want to be legally connected to the baby." Sarah's hand went to her stomach. "He has no rights to this child," she said firmly, "and I won't let him off easy just to ensure something that's already true." The prosecutor sighed. "I understand, but you should know, his defense is planning to call character witnesses tomorrow who will testify that you pursued him, that you had a history of seeking relationships with older authority figures." "That's a lie!" Sarah exclaimed. "Of course it is, but they're desperate and they'll say anything. Are you prepared for that?" After the call ended, we sat in silence for a long moment. Then Sarah stood up, her face resolute. "No deal," she said. "We finished this all the way through." The next day in court, the defense began presenting their case. As promised, they called several witnesses who painted Robert Jr. as a dedicated professor and Sarah as a troubled, manipulative student. Each testimony felt like a knife twisting in our hearts. During a recess, we huddled with the prosecutor in a private room. "They're desperate," she assured us. "The jury isn't buying it. But there's something else you should know." She hesitated. "Robert Jr.'s wife is here. She wants to speak with you." We exchanged glances with Sarah. "Why?" "She says she has information that could help your case." We agreed to meet her. Diane Wilson, a thin, elegant woman in her 50s, with tired eyes and a nervous manner. She wrung her hands as she spoke. "I believe you," she said simply. "Both of you. Robert has a history. I've suspected for years, but I never had proof." "What kind of history?" the prosecutor asked. "There have been other students. I found things, emails, gifts, photos. When I confronted him, he always had explanations, and I wanted to believe him. She looked down. We have a daughter, you know. She's 16. I've been watching him with her friends, the way he looks at them. She reached into her purse and pulled out a flash drive. Everything's here. Emails, financial records showing payments to 3 former students, journal entries where he writes about his conquests. She took a shaky breath. There's also a file about you, Sarah. He's been tracking your family for years. He knew exactly who you were when you applied to the program. The prosecutor took the flash drive, her expression grave. Mrs. Wilson, would you be willing to testify to this? She nodded, tears in her eyes. Yes, I should have done something sooner. I'm so sorry. When court resumed, the prosecutor requested an immediate conference with the judge and defense attorney. After 30 minutes, they returned, and the judge addressed the courtroom. This court is in recess until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Outside, the prosecutor explained what had happened. In light of new evidence, Robert Wilson Jr. has agreed to plead guilty to all charges. He's facing a minimum of 15 years. Sarah sagged against James, a mix of relief and exhaustion on her face. It's over? She asked. Almost, the prosecutor confirmed. He'll formally enter his plea tomorrow. You won't have to testify further or be cross-examined. That night, for the first time in weeks, we all slept through the night. The next morning, we returned to court to witness Robert Jr. enter his guilty plea. As the judge read out the charges, I watched the man who had caused so much suffering, my half-brother, my father's son, the embodiment of a legacy of abuse that had spanned generations. Would it end with him? I looked at Sarah, at the life growing inside her, and prayed that it would. As Robert Jr. was led away in handcuffs, Sarah gripped my hand. It doesn't end the nightmare, she whispered, but it's a start. Outside the courthouse, the same group of women who had supported us throughout the trial stood waiting. One stepped forward, an older woman, perhaps my age, and handed Sarah a small handmade blanket. For the baby, a new beginning. Little did we know how profound those words would prove to be. Robert Wilson Jr. was sentenced to 18 years in prison. The university where he had taught was facing multiple lawsuits, not just from Sarah, but from other victims who came forward after the trial. His wife filed for divorce and moved away with their daughter, hoping to give the girl a fresh start away from her father's infamy. For us, life had to continue. Sarah's due date was approaching, and there were preparations to be made. James had rearranged his residency to a hospital near our home so they could stay close during this difficult time. "Have you thought about names?" I asked Sarah one afternoon as we folded tiny clothes for the nursery. She looked up, a small smile on her face. "Hope," she said. "Her name will be Hope." It seemed appropriate, a beacon of light born from the darkest circumstances. Hope arrived on a bright spring morning, a beautiful baby girl with a full head of dark hair and perfect tiny fingers. When the nurse placed her in Sarah's arms, I held my breath, wondering if we would see shadows of the past in her features. But all I saw was a new life, innocent and full of possibility. James cut the umbilical cord, his hands steady, his eyes filled with tears of joy. "She's perfect," he whispered, kissing Sarah's forehead. The 3 of them became a family in that moment, not bound by blood, but by love and choice and courage. I watched them from the corner of the room, overcome with emotions too complex to name. In the weeks that followed, James and Sarah settled into parenthood with a devotion that moved me. James would walk the floor with Hope for hours when she was fussy, singing off-key lullabies until she drifted off. Sarah recovered from the birth with a newfound peace I hadn't seen in her since before the assault. "It's strange,"
she told me one night as we sat on the porch, Hope sleeping in her carrier between us. I thought I would have to work to separate her from how she came to be, but from the moment I saw her, she was just Hope, my daughter, nothing else. 3 months after Hope's birth, James and Sarah were married in a small ceremony in our backyard. David walked his sister down the aisle. Hope, dressed in a tiny white dress that matched her mother's, was carried by James's mother. It was a day of joy untainted by the shadows that had hung over us for so long. As they prepared to move to their own home, James had secured a position at a hospital an hour away so they could stay close during this difficult time. Sarah asked me a question I hadn't expected. "Mom, would you consider writing down your story, all of it, for Hope when she's old enough?" I hesitated. "Do you really want her to know?" Sarah nodded. "Not now, not soon, but someday, yes. She should know where she comes from and how we broke the chain. She should know about her grandfather Michael, who loved children who weren't his by blood as if they were their own. She should know about her great-grandmother Helen, who spent decades searching for the son taken from her." Sarah took my hand, her eyes earnest. "She should know about you, Mom, how strong you were, how you survived and built a life of love despite everything. These are her roots, too, not just the darkness." I promised I would think about it. After they moved, the house felt empty. I continued selling my pies at the farmer's market, finding comfort in the routine and the friendly faces of regular customers, but Sarah's request lingered in my mind. One rainy afternoon, I pulled out an old notebook and began to write. The words came slowly at first, painfully, as I excavated memories long buried. But gradually, the process became almost therapeutic. I was giving shape to the shapeless horror that had defined so much of my life, containing it within pages where it could no longer haunt me. I wrote through the fall and winter, filling notebook after notebook. I wrote about my childhood, about Michael, about our years of running and hiding. I wrote about Sarah and David, about the trial, about Hope's birth. I wrote about healing, about forgiveness, not for my father or his son, but for myself, for the guilt I had carried for not protecting Sarah better. When I finished, I mailed the notebooks to Sarah with a simple note. "For Hope, when the time is right. With all my love, Grandma Margaret." The years passed. Hope grew from a toddler to a little girl, bright and curious and compassionate beyond her years. She adored James, who was in every way that mattered her father. The biology that had troubled us so much before her birth seemed irrelevant in the face of their bond. Robert Wilson, Jr. died in prison 5 years into his sentence, a heart attack, just like my father. When we received the news, Sarah and I sat together in silence for a long time. "Do you feel anything?" she finally asked. Relief, and a strange kind of grief, not for him, but for all that was lost because of him, because of my father. "I feel free," Sarah said softly, like a shadow has lifted. As Hope approached her 8th birthday, I noticed subtle changes in her. Moments of quietness, flashes of a maturity beyond her years. "She reminds me of you," I told Sarah during one of their visits. She smiled. "James says the same thing. She has your strength, Mom." When Hope turned 10, Sarah called me with news that took my breath away. "We're adopting," she told me, her voice brimming with excitement. "A little boy just 3 months old. His mother was very young, not ready to be a parent. We meet him next week." 6 months later, I held my new grandson for the first time. They named him Michael, after the man who had taught them what true fatherhood means. Hope embraced her role as big sister with the same determination she brought to everything. I'm going to teach him all the important things, she announced solemnly, like how to make Grandma's apple pie and how to catch frogs without hurting them. On my 78th birthday, Sarah and her family came for a long weekend visit. While James and the children played in the yard, Sarah and I sat on the porch swing, just as we had done so many times before. Hope asked about her biological father yesterday, Sarah said quietly. My heart clenched. What did you tell her? The truth, a simplified version, that he was a bad man who hurt me, but that something beautiful came from it, her. That James chose to be her dad because he loves her, and that's what makes a real father. How did she take it? She smiled sadly. She was quiet for a while. Then she asked if the bad man could ever find her. I assured her she couldn't, that he's gone and can never hurt anyone else again. I nodded, relieved. And the notebooks? Have you... They're in a safe place. For when she's older, maybe much older. She deserves to know her history, but she deserves a childhood free from its weight, too. As twilight fell, I watched Hope and Michael chasing fireflies in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. James joined them, swooping Michael up onto his shoulders while Hope danced around them. Look at them, I said to Sarah. This is your legacy, not what was done to us. This joy, this love. She leaned her head on my shoulder, just as she had done as a little girl. I know, Mom. We broke the chain. After all these years, watching my granddaughter and her brother playing freely without shadows or secrets or fear, I finally believed it was true. The nightmare that had begun on the eve of my wedding 60 years ago had ended, not with more darkness, but with light. Hope, both the child and the feeling, had won. And that night, for the first time in decades, I dreamed not of running, but of staying right where I belonged, surrounded by the family that had survived it all.
5 years passed. Hope was now 15, a thoughtful teenager with a passion for science and a quiet determination that reminded me so much of Sarah at that age. Michael, 12 and full of energy, had James's easy charm and kind heart. Their family had moved closer to us after James accepted a position as head of pediatrics at the local hospital. My 80th birthday had come and gone with little fanfare at my insistence. No fuss, I'd told Sarah, just family and pie. But they'd surprised me anyway with a gathering of neighbors and friends from the farmer's market, where I still sold my pies each weekend. It was a good life, simpler and more peaceful than I could have imagined possible during those dark years of running. One spring afternoon, Hope came to visit me alone, riding her bicycle the short distance between our houses. I was in the kitchen, of course, teaching a neighbor's daughter my apple pie recipe. "Grandma, can I talk to you?" Hope asked after the girl had left with a freshly baked pie for her family. "Of course, sweetheart." I wiped my hands on my apron, noting the serious expression on her face. "Everything okay?" She sat at the kitchen table, fidgeting with the salt shaker. "Mom gave me your notebooks last week, for my birthday." My heart skipped a beat. Sarah and I had discussed this many times over the years, wondering when Hope would be ready. At 15, she was still so young, but Sarah had always been the best judge of her daughter's resilience. "I see," I said carefully, sitting across from her. "Have you read them?" She nodded, her eyes, so like her mother's, meeting mine directly. "All of them, twice." I waited, uncertain what to say. What does one say to a child who has just learned the darkest secrets of her family history, of her own origins? "I have questions," she said finally. "I'll answer whatever I can." She took a deep breath. "Were you ever angry at me because of how I came to be?" The question pierced my heart. Oh, Hope, no, never, not for a single moment.
From the first time I held you, you were just our hope, our miracle. But you must have been reminded every time you looked at me. I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. What I saw, what I still see, is the beautiful child who healed so much of our family's pain. You broke a cycle that had continued for generations. She seemed to consider this. Mom says I have your strength. You do, I assured her, and your mother's courage, and your father's compassion. James isn't my biological father, she said, and there was a question in the statement. James is your father in every way that matters, I said firmly. Biology is just chemistry. Family is something else entirely. Hope smiled then, a small one but genuine. That's what Mom said too. She paused. In your notebooks, you wrote that Grandpa Michael loved Mom even knowing she might not be her biological daughter. He did, from the moment he first held her. Just like Dad with me? Yes, exactly like that.
Hope fell silent for a moment, tracing patterns on the worn wooden tabletop. Then she asked, "Do you think evil can be inherited, like a gene or something?" The question took me by surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. "No," I said, with more certainty than I'd felt about anything in my life. Evil isn't passed down in blood. It's a choice, made day after day. Your great-grandfather made those choices. So did his son. But that chain is broken now. Because of you, Hope said. You ran. You protected Mom. You testified. And your mother protected you, I added. And you'll protect your children someday, if you choose to have them. That's the legacy we're passing down now. Protection, not harm. Hope seemed to relax slightly. There's something else I wanted to ask you. Anything. Will you teach me how to make your apple pie, the real way with all the secrets? Mom says she's never been able to get it exactly right. I laughed, relieved by the ordinary request after such a weighty conversation. Right now? Why not? She was already standing, reaching for an apron hanging by the stove. I want to learn all your recipes, Grandma. I want to keep them going. And so we spent the afternoon baking, my great-grandmother's recipe passing to the 5th generation. As I showed Hope how to cut butter into flour, how to slice apples just so, how to crimp the edges of the crust, I realized this too was a form of testimony, bearing witness not to trauma, but to survival, to the small joys that sustain us. The secret, I told her, is love. It sounds silly, but it's true. You have to love what you're making and who you're making it for. Hope nodded seriously, her hands covered in flour. Is that why everyone calls you Apple Pie Margaret? Partly, I admitted, but also because I've made an awful lot of pies over the years. She laughed, and the sound filled my kitchen, chasing away the last lingering shadows of the past. When Sarah came to pick her up later, she found us sitting on the porch, enjoying slices of still warm pie. She raised an eyebrow at me in silent question. I nodded slightly. Yes, we'd talked, and yes, everything was okay. Sarah joined us on the porch swing, accepting a plate. She said after the first bite. Just like I remember from when I was little. Hope made this one, I told her proudly. She has the touch. Of course she does, Sarah said, smiling at her daughter. She's a Carter woman. Hope beamed at this, sitting a little straighter. Grandma's going to teach me all her recipes. I'm going to write them down so they don't get lost. That's a wonderful idea, Sarah said. Some traditions should be preserved. As the three of us sat there,
Watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, I felt a profound sense of peace. The notebooks I'd written had served their purpose, allowing Hope to understand her history without being defined by it. Now she was creating her own story, one that acknowledged the past but wasn't bound by it. Later, after they'd gone home, I sat alone on the porch, thinking about the long, winding path that had led to this moment. From a frightened 17-year-old girl to a 78-year-old great-grandmother, I had walked through darkness I once thought would consume me entirely. But here I was, surrounded by a family that had not just survived, but thrived. The past couldn't be erased. The scars remained, but they no longer defined us. We had reclaimed our story, turning tragedy into a testament of resilience. And as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I whispered a silent thank you to Michael, who had loved us enough to help us escape, to begin again, to believe in the possibility of healing. Some nightmares end not with waking, but with transformation. Our family's darkest chapter had been rewritten not as a story of victimhood, but one of triumph, a legacy of strength that would continue long after I was gone.
But the most unexpected twist in our family story was still to come.
Hope's high school graduation fell on a perfect June day, the kind that seems made for new beginnings. She was valedictorian, standing tall at the podium in her cap and gown as she addressed her classmates. I sat between Sarah and James in the audience, tissue clutched in my hand, overwhelmed with pride. "Life doesn't always give us the start we might have chosen," Hope said, her clear voice carrying across the football field, "but it always gives us the chance to choose our path forward. The obstacles we face don't define us, how we respond to them does." She didn't look at us as she spoke these words, but I knew they were for us, an acknowledgement of the journey our family had taken, of the strength we had found together. After the ceremony, amid the chaos of photos and congratulations, a young woman approached us. She was perhaps 30, with a hesitant smile and eyes that seemed vaguely familiar. "Mrs. Carter?" she asked, looking at me. "Margaret Carter?" "Yes," I replied, puzzled. "My name is Rebecca Wilson." She held out her hand. "I believe you knew my father." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Wilson. She must be Robert Jr.'s daughter, the teenager his wife had mentioned during the trial all those years ago. Sarah stepped forward, instinctively moving between this stranger and Hope. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice calm but wary. Rebecca held up her hands. "I'm not here to cause trouble, I promise. I needed to meet you all. To apologize, I suppose, though I know that's not enough." "You have nothing to apologize for," I said firmly. "You weren't responsible for your father's actions." She smiled sadly. "No, but I've carried the shame of his name for 15 years. After the trial, my mother and I moved across the country. She changed our last name, but I always knew who I was, what he had done." Hope, who had been hanging back with James, stepped forward now. "You're my aunt," she said. It wasn't a question. Rebecca looked at her, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, though I understand if you want nothing to do with me." "Why are you here?" Sarah asked, still protective. Rebecca took a deep breath. "I'm a genetic counselor now. I work with families affected by hereditary diseases, helping them understand their risks, their options." She looked at Hope. "When I learned about you, about how you came to be, I wondered if anyone had ever talked to you about genetic testing." A chill ran through me. Why would she need genetic testing? "Because of the consanguinity," Rebecca explained gently, "the close biological relationship between her parents. It can increase the risk of certain genetic disorders, especially if they're carried in our family line." Hope looked at her mother, then at Rebecca. "Are you saying I might have something wrong with me? Genetically?" "Not necessarily," Rebecca assured her. "Many children born of close biological relatives are perfectly healthy, but it's something you should be aware of, especially if you plan to have children someday." Sarah's face had gone pale. "I never even thought. The doctors never mentioned." "It's not something that would necessarily show up in standard tests," Rebecca explained. "But there are comprehensive genetic panels available now that weren't when Hope was born." Hope stepped forward. "I want to be tested," she said decisively. "I need to know." "Honey," James began, concern evident in his voice. "No, Dad," she interrupted. "I'm not afraid of the truth. Our family doesn't hide from hard things anymore, right?" The weeks that followed were tense with waiting. Rebecca helped arrange the testing, guiding us through the process with a compassion that made it clear she was nothing like her father. Hope, ever practical, researched everything she could about genetic disorders and inheritance patterns, preparing herself for any outcome. When the results finally came, we gathered in our living room. Sarah, James, Hope, Michael, Rebecca, and me. The genetic counselor who had analyzed Hope's results explained everything in detail. "There are no major genetic disorders present," she assured me, and I felt a wave of relief so profound I nearly wept. "There are a few recessive genes that could potentially be problematic if Hope were to have children with someone carrying the same mutations." "So I'm okay, but my kids might not be?" Hope asked. "It means you'll need to be careful about family planning," the counselor explained. "Your future partner should be tested before you consider having biological children, and there are options. IVF with genetic screening, for instance, that can eliminate the risk entirely." Hope nodded, absorbing this information with the same quiet strength she brought to everything. "I can handle that." As the counselor continued explaining the technical details, I watched my great-granddaughter's face. There was no shame there, no horror at her origins, just a calm acceptance of the facts and a determination to move forward wisely. Later, after everyone had gone, Hope found me in the kitchen, washing dishes. Without a word, she picked up a towel and began drying. "Are you really okay?" I asked her. She nodded. "I am. It's actually a relief in a way. Knowledge is power, right?" I smiled at this phrase I had heard her say often over the years. "Right. Besides," she continued, "even if I can't have biological children someday, there's always adoption. Look at Michael. He's as much a part of our family as anyone." "You're an extraordinary young woman, Hope Carter," I told her, my heart full. She shrugged, but I could see she was pleased. "I come from a long line of extraordinary women." That fall, Hope left for college. Pre-med, like her mother before her, though she planned to specialize in genetics rather than pediatrics. As we helped her move into her dorm room, I was struck by how different her experience would be from Sarah's. She was going forward with full knowledge of her past, unafraid and unburdened by secrets. "Write me," I told her as we said goodbye. "Real letters, not just texts." "I will," she promised, hugging me tightly. "And I'll be home for Thanksgiving. You're making the pies, right?" "Always," I assured her. On the drive home, Sarah was unusually quiet. "What are you thinking about?" I asked her. She glanced at me, then back at the road. "About cycles, how some repeat and some break. How Hope is going to the same university where I met Robert, but her experience will be completely different because she knows the truth, because she's not alone." Sarah nodded, "because we stopped running and started fighting back." That night, I sat on my porch watching the stars emerge, thinking about all that had happened in my 78 years. The pain, yes, there had been so much of that, but also the love, the healing, the moments of pure joy that had sustained me through the darkest times. Our family story wasn't just about trauma anymore. It was about transcendence, about turning poison into medicine, as Hope would say, about choosing again and again to live fully despite everything that had been done to us. I thought about the name we had given my great-granddaughter all those years ago, Hope. It seemed aspirational then, a wish for what might be possible. Now it seemed prophetic. She had become the embodiment of what we'd all been seeking, a life beyond survival, a future unburdened by the past. The legacy of pain that began with my father had ended. In its place, we had built something new, a family bound not by secrecy and fear, but by truth and love and resilience. As I watched the night sky, I felt a profound sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy, the scars would always remain, but we had found our way through the darkness to a place where the light could finally reach us. And that, after all, was all I had ever truly wanted. For my daughter, for my granddaughter, for myself. Not perfection, not forgetting, just peace, and the freedom to write our own endings to a story that had once seemed destined for tragedy. In the quiet of that moment, under a canopy of stars, I felt grateful for it all. Even the pain, even the struggle. For without them, we might never have discovered just how strong we really were. And that knowledge, that hard-won wisdom, was perhaps the greatest legacy of all.